Welcome to the Planning to Win podcast. My name is Tom Lakatos. I'm a senior vice president at Lincoln Investment. The likelihood of your success financially increases when you are able to articulate your goals, when you share them with other people, and you write them down. In our experience as advisors, we can help you with some of the basic building blocks around financial planning and tackle some of the more common questions to help jumpstart your planning. And we're looking forward to bringing that to you in this series.
You could volunteer at a homeless shelter or something like that. It doesn't necessarily require a financial commitment per se.
We think about it in really three buckets: the implications on income tax, the implications on estate tax, and then ultimately capital gains taxes.
Now, in terms of the estate tax, there's typically no limit to what you can deduct, but it really depends on what in your estate tax you're looking to deduct.
Hi, folks. Welcome to the Planning to Win podcast. My name is Tom Lakatos, Senior Vice President at Lincoln Investment. I am fortunate enough to lead a team of advisors that work with about $1.3 billion in client assets, ranging from clients that are just starting out to wealthy clients looking to make some things happen with their financial situation. And it is November. November is National Arts and Humanities Month, and in alignment with that, we thought it'd be a really good emphasis to place on charitable gifting. We know that fundamentally Americans are very generous, both in terms of donations and in terms of the amount of time that they spend. Just high level, last year Americans donated almost $500 billion to their favorite churches, charities, nonprofits. A lot of people have their own personal causes that they get behind, and they frankly donated billions of hours of their free time to these causes. And I think that there's lots of reasons generally why people give. One is, and I can relate to this. I have a couple kids. One is 19 and is a college freshman. One is 16. And, it seems like the older I'm getting, the more I want to make sure that I pass on my values to my children. And donating is a way to do that. I also certainly would never be opposed to tax benefits, right? I already feel like I pay my fair share. So, opportunities to lower that's important. I certainly have some causes that are near and dear to my heart that, I donate to on a regular basis, and I don't think I'm unique. And ultimately, I like to stay informed and engaged in the world that I live in and ultimately try to make a difference. For today's session, I'm fortunate to have Eric Souter with me. Eric is one of the advisors on our team. He's also the member of our team that really spends time. He's certified to do tax. Eric, welcome. How are you?
Great. How are you, Tom?
I'm really good. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm
really excited to have you here.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. Well, Eric, so you heard that, right? We know from our work every day with clients that giving strategies is often a part of it. Why don't we start with this? When you think about giving, do you have to be wealthy to give?
I would say definitely not. I think the most common way that we see people give every single day is just by donating their time, honestly. You could run in a community 5K that benefits a charity, or, you could volunteer at a homeless shelter or something like that. It doesn't necessarily require a financial commitment per se, but, you are still giving your time, your energy towards something that you care deeply about.
Yeah, and I think when you think about that, because we get that a lot, like a lot of people think financial planning is for the really wealthy. And the truth is it's not, right? What we know and we say a lot is that we know statistically speaking that to maximize the likelihood that your goals happen, we know that if you wrote your goals down and you told somebody else about your goals, you're more likely to achieve those goals than somebody who doesn't do those things. And at its best, that's what financial planning really is. It's telling your goals to somebody else, writing them down, and then formulating a strategy. We see everyday Americans donating on a regular basis, right? They give on Sundays at their church. They tithe. They make contributions to fundraisers. They make donations to their college. But they also oftentimes have reasons to give because they may have some assets. Eric, talk a little bit, what do people generally give when they donate? And sometimes we do planned giving campaigns with clients. What generally do people donate?
I'd say the most common is cash, typically. Most people think about, for example, you mentioned the religious organizations dropping $5 into their collection basket at church on Sunday, or writing a check to their alma mater in some cases. But there's certainly some room for more of a strategy built out around that to benefit both you and the charity.
Yeah, think about, give me some examples of some things besides cash that people may give. You see some of that, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. So you can certainly donate things like public securities that we're more familiar with in our line of work: stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and in some cases, insurance. Normally, those are assets that have been owned for greater than 1 year, considered kind of a long-term holding at that point. Or outside of that, the non-public sort of securities such as restricted or company stock, shares of businesses, and even more commonly in some cases, real estate.
Yeah, and I think it's important for our listeners and viewers to know that ultimately the reason why we see that sometimes is because of the appreciation, right? And Eric, and what I mean specifically is, like, let's say, for example, you bought a house for $150,000 25 years ago, and that house today is $600,000 because your neighborhood shot up, right? And so that represents a potentially big capital gain. And depending on your beneficiaries or your sort of familial relationships, you may not have anyone to leave that to. And so, you certainly don't want to sell it and take a tax hit, and there might be some other strategies. Before we get to those strategies, Eric, talk just a little bit for me, if you would. What are the tax advantages? Obviously, there's tax benefits to giving. Why don't you start with what, you can deduct? We think about it in really three buckets: the implications on income tax, the implications on estate tax, and then ultimately capital gains taxes on the appreciation. Can you touch on those for me?
Sure. So normally any contributions, charitable contributions, are 100% deductible, but there are limitations to what you can deduct each year. So for example, cash, you can deduct 60% of your adjusted gross income. So basically your gross income minus business expenses, student loan interest payments, and other expenses. And those are considered public charities, or 30% in the case of private charities. It's a little different for donating things like securities. That would be 30% in the public sphere and 20% in the private sphere. And anything that you aren't able to deduct in that given year, you can normally carry forward an additional 5 years. Now, in terms of the estate tax, there's typically no limit to what you can deduct, but it gets a little, it really depends on what in your estate tax you're looking to deduct and some of the other implications of, what's included within that estate bucket.
Interesting. So we see this a lot where, as an example, let's say I've been sitting for years on my company stock. I've been accumulating it while I work throughout my working life. Maybe I worked at a big, publicly traded company, right? I'll give you an example of an extreme example that I read about just yesterday. Ironically, I was reading a forum, and one of the people started working 15 years ago at NVIDIA, as an example, and started accumulating company stock. This won't shock you. Maybe it will. His company stock through NVIDIA is worth $27 million with a tax basis of about $800,000. So he's obviously got massive tax implications, right? Those might be the kinds of things that we're talking about when we say you can donate. Now, that limitation, though, is real, right? You can deduct up to 30% in that case of your appreciated stock. It's a publicly traded company, so you could do up to 30% in any given year. Are there exclusions from the gift tax? Like if you wanted to donate, I know sometimes we deal sometimes with seniors that maybe have accumulated assets. They're never going to use them, so they start to divest of their assets by utilizing gift tax. Can you talk just a little bit about how gift tax exclusions work?
So in terms of gifts, most times in terms of spouses, you can pass between spouses without limitation. Now, in terms of incorporating charitable giving into your financial plan, a charitable gift while you're living, it might remove the gifted assets and any future appreciation from your estate.
Gotcha. What about if I wanted to give to my kids? Can I give to my kids tax-free a certain amount every year?
Let's see here. So the annual exclusion applies to gifts to each donee. So if you give each of your children $17,000 in 2023, the annual exclusion applies to each gift. So annual exclusion per donee is that 17,000.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, think about that, right? So think about, maybe you are in your 80s and you've got a bunch of assets that you're never going to use, and you want to start transferring that out of your estate now. Maybe if you're wealthy, you're bumping up on the estate tax limits, or you're maybe doing some planning in anticipation potentially of that reverting back to a prior year that's much lower than today's estate exclusion. So what you could start to do is think about that. And I think you can do 5 years at once. So that's, 17,000 times 5 is $85,000 at one time per kid. And if you had 4 kids, that's $320,000 roughly that you can pass forward. Talk about the big one, right? The big one we see all the time people are trying to avoid. And it's funny how people try to avoid it, but it's capital gains tax. How does it work with capital gains tax?
Yeah, so in capital gains taxes, like you said, it's sort of seen as this almost as this dirty word in a way, but in a way it means that you gained something and your assets appreciated, which is always a positive. I think that's ultimately what you're going for with any investment. But when you start with short-term gains, that would be, anything held for under a year. Deduction's normally the lesser of fair market value or your cost basis, so it's typically treated as if it's a cash, short-term gain, which can be, a little higher depending on your tax bracket. Long-term gains, though, what we see a little more frequently, things that are held over a year, 0 to 20% tax rate usually, depending on your income level, or in some cases it can be eliminated completely with, a properly designed donation. So just as a quick example of how you might look at cash donations versus a security donation of a long-term held asset. This is just an example based on a 37% federal tax bracket, which is about $570,000 of income. So, typically a much higher earner. Now, in that tax bracket, you have a Medicare surcharge on top of that 37%. So that's a small surcharge that the IRS assesses on top of the 37% there. So say you were trying to donate $50,000 worth of assets. If you donate them as cash, so you liquidate, say, a $50,000 stock position, you would be ultimately taking a hit of about $7,140. So you'd actually only be donating $42,860. Whereas if you donated those securities directly, you'd be able to donate the full $50,000 without any tax penalty.
Right, and that's the piece sometimes people forget. Right, it ends up being a 3.8% Medicare surtax that you pay on net investment income. Right, so in that example, the donated amount $50,000. You apply the 3.8 surtax to it, and $7,140 is the tax you have to pay, and the net $42,860 is what's tax deductible, versus donating the securities directly to the charity or the nonprofit. That Medicare surtax does not apply, and you get the full benefit of the 18.5 tax break in that example. Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny how you mention that. Like, we often deal with clients, like we tell people our job is to create capital gains ultimately. Managing them is different. But if you're investing well, there's going to be capital gains. It means you've chosen investments that are appreciating. And I think it's also part of a larger conversation sometimes around proper investing to talk about what level of gain you're comfortable with. We find too many clients that have sat on these positions for years and years and years and years. And the basis now is the gain is so large that it really becomes a burden to have to try to liquidate them. Eric, this has been really good. I appreciate the primer on the taxation. It's obviously one of the bigger reasons why people generally donate, and people with means get some benefit out of it. There are a lot of practical applications, as we talked about today. In our next session coming up soon, we'll talk to Zach Toom. Zach's another one of our advisors, and he'll get in a little more detail about the mechanics of how you make some of these donations. Thanks for joining us today. We'll look forward to seeing you again in our next installment.